It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Krish Seetah from Stanford University, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology at the Woods Institute for the Environment, co-director of many institutes. Dr. Seetah is a zooarchaeologist and especially the director of the Mauritian Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Project, which studies European imperialism and colonial activity. The project centers on the movement of peoples and materials cultures, and specifically within the context of slavery and diaspora. So the work has focused on many sites, and I'm sure what I'm saying right now, Krish, is much more minute than the actual scope of your research. But the idea of looking at the transition from enslavement to indentured labor following abolition and trade in the region, the environmental consequences of monoculture, and so on. So I am a Mauritian, and as a fellow Mauritian, I know Krish from our crisscrossings in Mauritius together. And I'm so glad that you accepted to be with us today, despite having just recently returned from Mauritius. It is very far away. It takes 2 days to get there. And I know you're probably still getting over some serious jet lag. So really, thank you for being here. So the way we've organized this very short webinar today is Krish will speak for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. And then at the end, I will briefly share some of the resources that I've prepared, and that will take us to about 8 or 8:15 at the latest. So thank you for being here, Krish, and I have unshared my screen so that you can take it away and lead us into some of your research today.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I just want to spend a bit of time putting some context to what I'm going to speak about. I really very quickly tried to go through positioning Mauritius' significance, basically, within the historic period, and try to balance that with how this fits with the modern world. I'll try to make connections. I know that we've been speaking about indenture, but I really hate to discuss either one of these two mechanisms of labor provision without talking about the other. So I'll try to blend both topics about enslavement and indenture. I haven't used the word resistance on this slide, although that was my remit, and I hope it's something that I'll come to and touch on a number of occasions. I'll spend some time situating a little bit of the history of the island and then the archaeological work itself, what the archaeology of Mauritius has actually been about. Talk to you about some of the sites briefly, just very quickly touch on methods and the sites themselves. But then I want to move into a couple of case studies and then focus on artifacts specifically. And I was mentioning to Elsa, this is not the most recent work. So if there's anything that I can sort of share with any of you in the future with sort of more recent work that we've been looking at in terms of genetics and so on, I'm very happy to do that. But I hope this gives a very good general background. And I know that you've had very good historical data sets and historical work presented to you by Richard Allen and Vijay Attila, colleagues that I'm very lucky to have had the chance to work with for quite some time. I really want to emphasize the richness of the archaeological record. I will focus on archaeological data sets specifically. And I'll just very quickly, I'll just start to introduce a very brief bit of background and just sort of break down the historical narrative that we've then tried to reconstruct from the island itself. So one of the first sites I want to focus on, which historical context, is Fort Frédéric. This little image here is Fort Frédéric, which from the 17th of September 1958, that's when the Dutch first settled, and they named the island Mauritius after the then Dutch stadholder Maurice van Nassau. It was an unsuccessful settlement, and despite another attempt at settlement in the early 1600s, the island was abandoned by 1710. This is an image of Maille de la Bourdonnais. From 1715, Mauritius was claimed by the French and settled by them in 1721 and renamed Île-de-France. And it was the first sustained, successful, and the longest running colonization event for the island. And this is a monument commemorating the 1810 battle between the French and British. And ultimately, the French lost the naval battle and capitulated to the British, who took over the administration. I need to give a little bit of nuance there. Actually, the French won a battle, the Battle of Vieux-Grand-Port, which is actually commemorated on l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. But that led the British really to say, okay, we need to be much more effective here. And they landed 10,000 troops to the north of the island, to the then France's 2,000. And of course, they were victorious. But what's important is that they made very significant concessions to the French plantocracy. And that's ultimately ended up framing much of the island's historical culture. And of course, that's then been a mechanism by which a lot of other cultures have been absorbed into the island. Where we tend to stop is at this point, but I want to make sure that I emphasize 21st of March, 1968 was independence. And so Sir Sagar Hamgoulam leads the country to a peaceful independence. The island, like many other colonies that gained independence, was expected to collapse. But perhaps due to its particular past, perhaps due to the relationships that were maintained. So Sagar was actually educated in Britain. Perhaps due to all of these factors combined, it didn't. And it's become what very tongue-in-cheek has been coined an African success story. While having the highest population density in Africa, it also has one of the highest GDPs per capita, one of the longest running democracies. On all the metrics that, for example, the US, I just spoke to the number 3 from the US Embassy. I've lost his card there, Andrew Fields. Basically, Mauritius does very well. And so its past has had a strong influence on its present. And that's been a really important way for Mauritius to sort of emerge and sort of clear itself as a nation, which has a very plural culture and a very complex history and a very deep legacy of colonialism that it's still dealing with to the present day on both ecological and social fronts. And that leads us nicely to the archaeology. Just a map here situating the island. Sorry, I may have a little child jumping in, maybe not. Our work is sort of focused on 3 themes. The first is the ecology. Mauritius has no indigenous population. All changes are consequential to human activity and effectively resource exploitation. And for those of you who are, who sort of teach on these topics, I have difficulty with the term indigenous, because what does that mean? That's sort of a defined term that's put onto people around the world. So, I think we can have some discussion around that if that comes to mind. Enslavement was from the period of, actually from the very first Dutch settlements. Enslavement was a feature of the island, but became particularly prevalent for plantation systems that were instituted. So Mauritius, although in the Indian Ocean, has a system of colonialism much more like the Atlantic, which focuses on monocrop agriculture. Each colonial group brought a diversity of enslaved peoples with them from different ethnic backgrounds. And according to Richard Allen, who I know you've heard from, it was one of the most diverse regions in the world. Now, our own genetics, which I won't talk to you about today, but our own genetics have shown that as well. So the kind of scientific investigations through archaeology, ancient DNA, and the history are really aligning very well. The island served was a hub for enslaved people from Africa and Asia. About 30% of enslaved people during this period were actually coming from Asia itself. From a number of reasons, slave revolts were relatively common, although the type of slave republics that are known from the Atlantic context were not established. And from 1810, the island, as we just heard mentioned, was the site for the Great Experiment, which is a system adopted globally, and it led to indenture. So a population of about 90,000 enslaved people transitioned very, very quickly to about 400,000 people, predominantly of Asian descent. Enslavement predominantly of African descent. Mauritius is arguably one of the most important hubs in the Indian Ocean for studying both enslavement and indenture. And it's really just a phenomenal place for studying the process of colonization and colonialism itself combined. Our sites really attempt to capture this range of people. And of course, we need a range of sites to do that. And our work has effectively seen the island as the site, a total archaeology. And we haven't had many deep multi-phase archaeological projects dating back several thousand years. That's just not the archaeology of the region. But what we've tried to do is really integrate all the elements to produce as holistic a picture as possible. What's absent from the work that I'm showing you today is the maritime context, maritime archaeology. which we have a very extensive project working with the Mauritian government and NGOs, Coast Guards, etc., all local stakeholders. But again, that's a topic for another time and something I'm happy to talk to you about. I'm going to keep this slide and just sort of, keep this this table here and run through specifically. So for the ecological context, there's 2 sites of significance, which really serve as points of departure for approaching the environmental assessment of the island. I'm going to run through this very quickly. This is Trouabiche, sorry, not Trouabiche, Trouaseaf, a lake crater in the center of the island, and we have undertaken some work there with colleagues. We have an idea that we will actually core these craters to get some really deep environmental ecological knowledge. We want to understand what the influence of monocrop sugar agriculture has been on the island more broadly. And so we're starting at these kind of pristine sites. There's really key investigations that will allow us through this kind of ecological mapping to look at the transition from enslavement to indenture. And I just want to show you very quickly, we do that through sediment cores. From these cores of soil, from sediment itself, we'll look at phytoliths, we'll look at pollen, etc. And we'll overlay that. One of the plans is to actually overlay that in the future with LiDAR scans to see the terrestrial context and how that's changed over time. LiDAR is also very useful for us to capture evidence on changing ecological context over time as well through various ways, and various mechanisms of looking at vegetation change over time. Just moving on, of course, we want to focus on all features of the archaeology, but I do want to take a pause here and say that I hope I'm not giving you the impression that we're the first group. Archaeology has actually been undertaken. Jeff Summers, who I know Elsa knows well. There was a Dutch team, led by Peter Floor. The issue was that much of this archaeology was focused on the imperial signatures. They were looking at forts and so on. And that wasn't really being well connected to the broader population, 98% of which are descendant of enslaved and indentured people. So our effort has been to look at enslavement and indenture, but we of course want to look at that within a much broader context. So we also do look at some colonial enclaves, and in particular, I want to show you Flat Island, which is a quarantine station. And we're looking at this because of work that we're doing on disease. We're developing predictive models for disease using AI. Again, that's work I won't talk to you about, but we're using these sites to provide longitudinal evidence for how we'll then model the changing landscapes of disease from the island itself, which underwent periods of epidemic disease over and over again. This site has some wonderful standing archaeology as well as cemetery sites, all of which we've mapped and modeled, and we're fitting into a much broader context for the island itself. And now moving more specifically to the context that we're focused on for this tour, looking at enslavement, for example, there was a really interesting context with enslavement in terms of the diversity of people that were coming and the roles of enslaved people within both the plantation system, but also more widely within the environment itself or within the island more broadly. Our work is focused on the site of Le Morne, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as well as more recently we've looked at a likely site of burial for enslaved people in Albion. And this monument actually commemorates Marounage, which was sort of linking both the global and local context of Mauritius to the broader setting of resistance itself. Now, this image that I'm showing you here, this statue, this sculpture, is really emblematic. It's trying to show, it actually marks the World Heritage Site itself. It's actually part of that memorial, but it shows this is out of basalt, and it's showing the effort of breaking out of enslavement by the local population. And so it's a really important site. It's incredibly poignant, and I'll come to explain a little bit more about that. The true ending, it's interesting that the trade in slavery is stopped in 1807. Enslavement as a process, as a mechanism of labor provision carries on until the 1830s. And those legacies have been deeply rooted into Mauritian culture. And we're working with the Nelson Mandela Center for African Culture does a fantastic job of sort of centralizing the work of, the efforts and the contribution to Mauritian culture, Siga, our music, our language, Creole, And the only religious practice, the only spiritual system that evolved in Mauritius itself, l'organisme, are all elements that have evolved from the period of enslavement and adopted other facets into that. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that now. So two of these sites of particular significance. This is Le Morne itself, the World Heritage Site, and it's only the Brabant, it's only the top here that is actually considered World Heritage. The rest of that plateau is all owned by one family. It's taken a long time of negotiation to actually allow access for the local population, effectively as a site of pilgrimage to commemorate this site. We've been working on there since 2009, and in fact led by facilitated by Vijaya Tilak. Our work is actually focused on a cemetery site, which we were led to in 2009, and you can just see at the bottom here where the site is located on Mauritius itself. There we go. And I'll show you a couple of images, and it's a really fantastic site. This is the V gap here, which would have had to be crossed, and here's a very sketchy, not very good quality drone imagery of what it was like from the plateau. So few places are more appropriate on Mauritius for studying resistance to enslavement. This site is commemorated locally because of an oral history. It was, in fact, one of the first sites, one of the early sites to have been commemorated for its intangible context as well. And the local narrative suggests that at the point when a group of enslaved people had run away to the Brabant itself, had found refuge at the top of this site, they saw a group of soldiers coming towards them. They thought that they were going to be going back into enslavement. So rather than go back into enslavement, they jumped off this cliff to their deaths. And actually, the soldiers that were coming to them were British soldiers coming to tell them they were free. And that's made its way into local Siga. That's a really poignant moment in the history of the island. And it's an incredibly important site for Mauritians of enslaved, but also Mauritians generally as a site of commemoration to this historic past, to this enslaved past. The cemetery itself was effectively unknown. Originally, about 4 or 5 grave markers were outlined, and I'll just show you an image of what the type of thing that was sort of seen initially. Sorry, I realize you're probably seeing that there, so I'll close that off. This was what was noted initially. With our work in 2009, we were led to these grave markers. Now, the modern context is actually a site of l'organisme, of ritual practice, which involves sometimes the sacrifice of birds and so on, but mostly there was a lot of these kind of effigies of l'organisme practice, which might translate to voodoo, vodou, Santeria in the Atlantic context, if that helps you sort of make the connection. The cross is modern, but effectively l'organisme adopts the practices that institute power. And there was a local tradition, local knowledge that this was a site of power because of people having been buried there. With our work, which was requested by the then Le Morne Trust Fund director and the local community, we found 45 structures in 2012, and the evidence suggests that there's many more graves. Initially, there was no expectation of finding skeletal remains. There was a huge effort to look at the surface disturbance and so on. But of course, these are famous last words. And when we started the work and started clearing, whoops, sorry, let me just pick that over. Yes, this is actually what we discovered. It's an incredible site. It's ephemeral. Many of these elements now, to my knowledge, are still maintained in this sort of fashion. And there's a plaque that commemorates the DNA work that we undertook from the site. There's a plaque that commemorates the fact that our findings showed the individuals buried at this site were actually of Malagasy and Mozambican descent on the maternal lines. I just want to spend a bit of time showing you some of the artifacts that came up. One of the things that was really important, we understood, we deepened our understanding of the lifeways, the burial practices of enslaved people. And this site probably commemorates both enslaved and people who were emancipated. It's the first such site for the Republic of Mauritius. It received intense national attention, was regularly featured on TV. In fact, the day that we were able to, we told the then director of the Le Morne Trust Fund that we had the DNA results. He called the Minister of Arts and Culture, who called the press, and this was a Sunday evening Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock, the press were at the site to make the announcement on national TV, which went live that night. So it really gives you a sense of the importance of this site. I'm just going to talk to you about a small suite. This is from 2010. 8 graves were opened in total, recovering 11 human individuals. It's really interesting to point out that children were quite well represented. And again, this is very common in the archaeological record, in the archaeological past, because children often have a high rate of mortality. I want to just ask you to look at this picture and tell me what's interesting here. Maybe, well, you won't tell me, but I'll tell you. Right off, initially, you can see there's a darker outline around this child's inhumation. And that's a grave site. That's the grave site. That's an actual coffin, which for an enslaved person already was telling us more than we would have anticipated, because often enslaved people are buried in simple shrouds. So there was already indications. Now this darker outline literally is just a staining of the sand. It's about less than a millimeter or so, a millimeter, no more than 2 millimeters of thickness in some areas. It's only Sasha Chaval, my colleague, it's only by efforts of her capacity as an archaeologist, her skill as an archaeologist, that revealed this outline. So without actually finding any wood, we were able to find evidence for a coffin. And this image actually won the Antiquity Journal Image Prize a few years ago, because it really, more than just a picture, it actually revealed so much more about the context we were talking about. Even in the absence of artifacts itself, it literally was just a change in the pigmentation of the soil. This child evidently had a coffin, which was already telling us a lot. From this, there was a set of twins. We found a stillborn fetus, 3 juveniles and 5 adults, and things like this, which on another site might mean very, very little. This is a mother of pearl button. So again, we know something, we learned something about what type of clothing these individuals had, and something as insignificant as a button on another site was incredibly significant on this site, because it was telling us a lot more, what types of artifacts were enslaved people able to garner for themselves under these very difficult and brutal conditions. Some of the things, again, we're sort of learning, we learned a lot from these sites. So again, while just coming back to Elsa's point, while I'm showing you this, I want you to think about what it means to compare this type of research with the historical records, which won't really note the types of constructions, the materials that were being used for these inhumations. And what I want to point out, not only were they used, but there was reuse. Here's the original coffin outline. Here's another commemoration. Here's a third level. So there was memory here. But what often happens is that the initial burial was here. The commemoration the first row of stones might be here. The second one might be there. The third one might be there. Because of course there isn't a precise memory in that sense. But it does show these redelineations with larger stones, more visually represented with basalt blocks that were actually cut. It shows reverence for the interred. So we're adding layers of complexity to our understanding of this burial site and of enslavement itself from the archaeological record. And I just want to point this out. This was actually work published not so long ago, actually a decade ago now that I think about it. This was the site of a female individual, one of the most poignant, actually, examples. And again, sort of talking about working conditions and social memory and so on. But what was interesting here was that this mother was buried, I don't know if this is clear, I hope this image makes it clearer, with her child. And we actually think this may have been what's termed a coffin birth. So the mother died during the process of giving birth and was buried with her child, still inside the belly. And through the process of decomposition, the baby is effectively expelled. It looks like the baby has been laid between the mother's knees, but in fact, it's probably a process of coffin birth in this case. So these kind of details, really at the most basic fundamental elements of a person's life and their life history, are incredibly enriching for our understanding of this period, and adds important dimensions to what we understand from the historical record. And actually, archaeology and history, I want to start making that connection. It really is something fundamentally different that we're able to provide. Just moving on, I want to point out, sort of expanding the archaeological framework, we started to see the complexity. So there was overlaying components of burials. So burial sites we can just see the head here, but there was another burial cut right above, and you can see another one here. So there were intersections of these burials. There was great complexity and size, and really a wholly different range of finds were coming out from later excavations in 2012. For example, these pipes. I'm just going to ask you to look at these pipes, pause them for a second, come back and talk to you about those in more detail later on. These are 2012, 2013. And then there were finds that really were quite outstanding. We can't really explain, but this cup was actually placed right at the very top of the burial. So again, an artifact that was used to commemorate the burial as a whole. It wasn't actually buried with the individuals themselves. Just very briefly, I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but I do just want to mention that we did undertake the first ADNA analysis for the island. We had the first successful extraction, and we showed of these individuals, 6 were Mozambique and 2 were Madagascar. And we had a carbon date to around 1751, which had a kind of fairly large margin of error, but it put us towards the ending of enslavement for some of the later dates that we had. And I just want to very quickly then move on to, actually, I'll show you this picture because I want you, maybe if you've got time, to ask me about these coins, but I won't say anything more about them now. I want to transition very quickly now to Indenture. I deliberately started with a blank slide because while I have many images and a lot of historical work for enslavement, we've done relatively less for the period of Indenture. In fact, Mauritius is the first place where there is a systematic effort to study the period of Indenture from an archaeological perspective. We're very fortunate to have good historical research from this period. And the Upper Vasigat Trust Fund was, in fact, the island's first World Heritage Site. And these steps actually commemorate that moment where the great experiment was undertaken. And the first indentured laborers at Upper Vasigat went up these steps to commence their new life. There's much less recognition and investigation of the role of indentured laborers. And as Elsa mentioned, this was a global phenomenon, but it's received relatively little attention. And so the archaeology of indenture at the moment is effectively a Mauritian phenomenon. And we're hoping that actually expands because many other parts of the world adopted this system. Although laborers were coming as engaged workers, replacing the kind of morally reprehensible trade in enslavement in enslaved people, there were many overlaps, many parallels in the treatment, and some of this was subtle, some of this was much more similar in terms of the treatment of people, the levels of control, the movements. So under enslavement, there was absconding and marronage. Under indenture, it was called vagrancy, and there was the establishment of the vagrant depot. But really, 3 things are fundamentally different. 3 cultural features are fundamentally different between enslavement and indenture. For indentured laborers, they're effectively allowed to keep their language, their religion, and their names. And that really marks a difference, for me anyway, looking at this. Of course, there's many other factors, but I think the key ones are cultural. And that meant that indentured laborers were able to maintain a connection to their past in a way that enslaved people were unable to. So just coming back to this kind of catch-all table, we've worked with Upper Vasigat itself, the World Heritage Site, as well as Triano, which was a laboring site of labor. We actually recovered the first, these are chickpea seeds. These were the first archaeobotanical finds from the island. It would be no surprise that they were chickpeas coming from an indentured labor sites because the French and the British, not through positive ways, but actually made an effort to figure out the types of foods that they should bring in for the indentured laborers, because they were being sold to the indentured laborers, not because they had a kind of good sense for the people that they were working with. And we also worked on a cemetery site, Bois Marchand. The area of which that we worked on was actually specifically the cemetery itself, which I'll show you now, was established specifically, and here's just noting where that is for the island. It's not that far from Port Louis. The cemetery itself was established because of a malaria epidemic that wiped out 10% of the population. And so we have a project that's focused specifically on using data sets from this site to develop predictive models for vector-borne disease more generally. And as I said, I won't go into that, but we've worked very closely. These are our These are our colleagues who are actually I want to express something here. The way that this site was initially used as a cemetery has been maintained to the modern day. So the cemetery is still, it's a formal cemetery used today. In fact, my grandmother is buried in this cemetery. There just happens to be a large portion of the cemetery that was never reopened from the historical period because of one word, malaria, or as the Italians pronounce it, malaria, bad air. So the idea, so once the epidemic had passed, there was a portion of the cemetery that was not opened. In fact, indentured laborers who should have been burnt during this period because of the adherence to the Hindu faith were buried. But there were this portion of a portion of the site was never reused. So we were very fortunate to find a portion of the site that's about half a kilometer in length, 30 to 40 meters in width, that has been left untouched. And you can see these inhumations, these are the grave outlines, are exactly the same in other parts of the cemetery that have been opened and reopened. And it's these colleagues here who are the local grave diggers who have been following that tradition. You can just see their hoe here. There's one hoe length to delimit a grave and one hoe length roughly to delimit the space between a grave. And that process has been unchanged since it was first started in 1868. I very quickly want to show you some of the artifacts from there. These are the types of artifacts that are coming out. But what we've come to understand is that while many of the individuals buried here are indentured laborers, some of them are not, or they're indentured laborers who had, they're unlikely to be indentured laborers because there was wealth associated. These were embossed decorations on the coffins themselves. This is a lead-lined, wooden cross, but lead-lined, and this individual was in a lead-lined coffin. So there's no way this person was indentured labor. There were other people being buried here. And under conditions of epidemic or pandemic, as we've just experienced as a global community, inhumations don't necessarily follow the status quo, the norm. We really do have to take on new attitudes. And so we expected and we anticipated very different population here, and we do have a mixed portion of the population. What's very, very beneficial as well is that while we have maps from this site, we've also got burial records dating back to 1868. So we've got really good historical records to correlate what we're finding in the archaeological record itself. And I just want to tell you the latest bit of news from this site, which was known as a site of malaria epidemic. As I said to you, we're developing predictive models using evidence from here. We have actually recovered the DNA of two forms of malaria falciparum and malaria, as well as smallpox from individuals from this site. So we know very well now, very clearly, that this was a site of epidemic burials. And so I just take a pause. I hope that's some background and some context to not only the island, historically speaking, but also to the work of our archaeological work and the types of finds that we've been able to recover, and how we've sort of integrated that into local mechanisms of valorization and so on. So much of our work, we've done our best to sort of seed that into local museums and so on. I want now to focus on a set of artifacts and sort of wrap up with a small case study on very specific. So Le Morne, I hope, has shown what resistance was like in a very fundamental way, resisting enslavement by running away at the time of enslavement itself. But I want to show you other elements of how archaeology can make that picture more complex and more nuanced and deepen our understanding in very meaningful ways about this context of resistance itself. But I'm going to start with showing you a shackle. And we undertook very detailed finds analysis and provenance analysis to understand the fabric of this shackle. But this shackle was actually found on Trianon. And although it's been noted as a slave shackle, it was found with layers that were associated with indenture. So when I was talking to you about indenture, I said that many of the mechanisms seem to have been mimicked the kind of conditions under enslavement. It would seem as if, even to the point of the shackle, indenture did have correlates with what was seen under the conditions of enslavement itself. So I just want to give you a sense of how these artifacts can really help us reshape our understanding and provide much more detail around topics that we sort of tend to assume, at the end of enslavement, the treatment of indentured laborers was much better. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case, at least within certain contexts and certain geographies. From Bois Marchand, I want to show you the type of things that can be done with these, these artifacts once restored, really represent important finds that can then make their way to museums and so on. And I'll show you another case study of that in the next slide. But I want to show you also just finds that even I at times find staggering. I wonder if you can tell me, at least give a few seconds to think about what this might be. And I'll tell you that this is actually a ring recovered from one of the grave inhumations from Bois Marchand itself. And just stepping back, you might be able to see this, actually a fingerprint. So we were able to recover a fingerprint from a ring. From colleagues in Slovenia were able to do this by using certain chemical mechanisms to lift up the fingerprint and make it clearer. And we may be able to correlate that. Of course, the fingerprint itself may not be from the individual wearing the ring, but we may be able to correlate that because we've got burial records of these individuals where they were buried. We may be able to really marry up a very refined microhistory of this individual, literally right down to their fingerprint. These finds now, in another context, again, these are earrings. They are in fact made of gold with these little beads. And at first we were wondering what they were. They're actually lead glass beads, very, very small, incredibly detailed. Given the context, maybe it's evident now. But if I was talking about these earrings from another archaeological context, they would be important because they're gold. They obviously have some value, but they may not be that significant. These earrings were actually recovered from the grave of an enslaved woman. And they're perhaps the most, and I use this term very carefully, the most valuable artifact recovered from any enslaved person, possibly in the world. And this really challenges our current ideas about enslaved lifeways. How did this person, this was a site in Albion. Everything about this site is pointing to the fact that these individuals are of African descent. They look to be people who are under very difficult conditions of work. So it looks like they are people who are under conditions of enslavement. And yet these earrings are gold with lead glass beads. And they're incredibly important. If we think about Henrietta Tubman's shawl in the Smithsonian, given to her by Queen Victoria, these are arguably as significant in that context of what grave goods actually mean for an individual. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these were from excavations in 2022. This is the Intercontinental Slavery Museum, inaugurated in August 2023. And we were able very, very quickly to conserve and have these earrings be part of exhibitions in this museum that's commemorating enslavement for its inauguration just 8 months ago. That's a really important moment for us in terms of bringing our work out to the wider public. This is sort of, I'll run out my last few minutes with a final case study. I mentioned to you that I'd come back to talk to you about the pipes. I want to situate 2012-2013 season. I want to situate where these pipes are actually coming from, because it's really important. Literally right under the arm of an enslaved man, there was 3 individuals who had pipes with them, 3 males. A closer look at the pipes themselves with sort of proper archaeological pictures. And from each of these pipes, there is this, you can see under the conditions of use, these pipes have been burnt, of course. And what we did was we undertook residue analysis, which I'll show you in a second. But these are the pipes from Le Morne. We had undertaken some work with Aprovasi Ghat, the other World Heritage Site I mentioned, as part of excavations that were taken before an interpretation center was established. In fact, these excavations were tidied up and kept as part of the interpretation center. And if you go to Mauritius, you'll see this work there. But what I want to focus on are pipes. These are chillums. So while we had these white clay pipes come from the site of Le Morne, and these chillums and hookah ends coming from Aprovasi Ghat, we undertook residue analysis from all of these. Just one point I want to make very carefully now: while the pipe from Limon was in a very secure context that you can't get more secure than that. From Upper Basigat, the context was less secure. There was potentially some mixing of artifact types. So we can't associate these pipes specifically with a group of indentured laborers. It's just that indentured laborers were using this type of smoking device. So I just want to make that connection, but also make that clarity in terms of the security of the site itself. In any case, we undertook residue analysis. So we're scraping off, this is at high resolution, we're scraping off these residues. Now, in general, I want to just come back to the pipes themselves. These pipes, from an archaeological perspective, because they are European white clay pipes and Europeans use them to smoke tobacco, we've always assumed that they were used to smoke tobacco by all groups who use them. We've never actually undertaken the analysis. So to my knowledge, and certainly for this region, our group was one of the first to undertake this analysis. And guess what we found? Of course, we found tobacco. It might be expected because tobacco has been moved around in very large quantities from 1650. What we might not have expected, but we did find, what we might have also expected, and we did find, was cannabis. Even the historical research suggests that the historical research suggests that Indian indentured laborers brought cannabis to Mauritius, but evidently this cannabis was found in the pipes from both the Chillums, but more specifically, they were found in the pipes from Limon, the pipe of an enslaved man. What we also found from the Upper Basigat site was opium. Again, we knew that opium was coming to Mauritius, so we may have some suggestions. What we would have had absolutely no idea, no anticipation of finding was this plant, which is a mint Laminaceae family, Salvia divinorum. This is a hallucinogen used by the Mazteca people from Oaxaca in Mexico, 17,000 kilometers away in a straight line from Mauritius. It was only known to Western science in 1938. And it's used for divination and in spiritual context. It's not, there's some palliative strategy, but it's not used, it's not smoked, it's actually chewed, and we found it in a pipe. So really understanding how and why these plants arrived in Mauritius and how they end up in the grave of an enslaved man, all of these are completely unknown in terms of historical context, in terms of how they were used by enslaved and indentured people. But of course, our speculation, which I think is well-founded, if I come back to this slide, I want to just point out the osteological remains as well. Many of these are not what we showed sign of disease, osteomyelitis. I've got images here that show you that more specifically. So we actually believe these were part of the palliative strategies of these enslaved people. And, we're talking about, we had a lot of indications of inflammatory disease in the bone, in injuries that were caused through, injuries to the body caused through extensive labor, and also dental disease. So these products seem to be used both for, at least within the enslaved context, as part of palliative strategies. It may be possible, some of the earliest evidence we have of the use of cannabis in an archaeological record is actually within the context of childbirth. This is highly speculative, but I do just want to make the suggestion it could have been part even within that context. There's also suggestions, much less speculative, of use within spiritual context. So this may have connected with the Longanista spiritualism and the more recreational components of this site specifically. And needless, I just want to point out, Sega Tipik, which is an UNESCO inscribed dance and music, was known to have been practiced within this local region from oral traditions. So this really is important chronological markers for the kind of dynamic role of medicinal plants in society, but much more specifically within a kind of decolonization and resistance context. It really does show us something complicated and important about the way laboring peoples, their own agency, how they responded. And I just want to come back to the opium here. Opium had a major role in creating famine in India, in parts of India, that then forced people into indenture. And this is an image from Patna. These are all the stacks of opium, and this is John Bull effectively forcing opium onto the Chinese. I won't go into it, but the British effectively created the largest epidemic of addiction. 13 to 14 million people in China were addicted to opium during the period of the Opium Wars between Britain, France, and China. How that plays out in Mauritius more specifically is that we actually know that the then government, the imperial government, allowed opium to be used, and through oral histories that we've taken, these are what we call ganja dukan, where opium was smoked as a kind of recreational process to alleviate the pain of work, to kind of have a moment away from the working conditions. And we knew that was, all of traditions have told us that took place on Saturday. And these ganja dukan, they were allowed to be built, and it was the men who were mainly involved in that. It was a kind of a moment of recreation. But the broader scale, what I want to emphasize is that this really shows us through the archaeology how people in Mauritius, these laboring communities, were connected around the world through the movement of these goods. And just as I summarize and end, I want to point to some publications which I'm happy to pass on. There is a book that kind of summarizes a lot of the archaeology and history of the region. And I point you to many partners that we have on this work, many local partners as well. Thank you very much.